India Study Circle is conducting this talk is based on one of our objectives, that is to initiate debate and discussions within the academic community of IIT Madras on economic, social, political and cultural issues which will affect the public at large. So, the role with the early talks we have conducted, this issue is also a contemporary thing. Like, since the government of India is busy with modifying their educational policy in accordance with the General Agreement on Trade in Services, which is put forward by WTO, World Trade Organization, and they are planning to submit their proposal on the upcoming WTO meeting at Nairobi in December. So the government of India's new education policy will be an onward march on imperialism and saffronization, which has many links within multi-level function in this campus. So after APSC has been banned, derecognized.
Sorry, there was some clarification.
No sir, just mention. More and more rules are coming up these days in order to curtail the activities of social activities in the campus, in many campuses. Even UGC is recommending for an LinkedIn recommendation in all Indian educational institutes. So I think this talk is very relevant at this present point of time. And so, today's lecture will be conducted. The speaker for today's lecture will be Dr. Ajantha Subramanian. She's a professor in social anthropology from the Department of Anthropology, Harvard University, USA. Her research and teaching interest includes political economy, colonialism and post-coloniality, political ecology, space, social movements, citizenship, South Asian diaspora. And we have authored a book on shorelines, space and life in South India, published by Stanford University Press in 2009, which deals with the struggles for resource rights by Catholic fishers on India's southwestern coast. Her current research is on relationship between meritocracy and democracy in India, with a focus on how it plays out within Indian engineering education. She published the research article "Making Merit: The Indian Institute of Technology and the Social Life of Caste" in the Journal of Comparative Studies in Society and History. Professor Ajantha Subramanian is also an activist. She was a part of Center for People Movement in 1990 to 1992, which is an organization of Madras cities controllers. In 1994, she was the organizer for the Colonial Fishers Union, Kanyakumari, and she was also an interviewer and consultant for the documentary Fishing in the Sea of Greed, directed by Anand in the year of 1998. In 2000, she was the producer of documentary Desi, South Asians in New York. The documentary talks about the growing sense of cultural unity among Indians, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, Sri Lankans and Nepalis living in the USA. And in connection with the APSC issue, she has written 2 articles on Open Magazine and Counter, and we will be distributing one of the articles on the floor. And I welcome Ajantha Subramanian to deliver the talk.
And I'm also grateful, as I'm sure many of you are, for the work that they're doing to stimulate debate, much heated debate on this campus around questions of caste, questions of equality, questions of nationalism. So I'm very happy to participate in one of their events. So what I'd like to do today is the following. I will first give you a sense of how caste stratification worked within engineering education in the pre-independence period. Next, I'll lay out how the relationship between caste and merit is framed within constitutional language, especially the language dealing with the question of redress for historical injustices perpetrated in the name of caste. Third, I'll talk about how this constitutional language gets taken up within the IITs to advance arguments about merit. And I'll also talk about how these arguments work somewhat differently in IIT Madras because of the larger context of Tamil Nadu. So how Tamil Nadu shapes these arguments about merit somewhat distinctly. And then finally, I'm going to end with some examples of anti-reservation politics and how the claims that are made within anti-reservation politics have themselves gone through some changes over the years. So I know this is a lot to digest, and it will be a fairly long talk, but I hope you'll bear with me as I take you through. In brief, just to anticipate what I'm going to argue, what I want to show you is that merit has never simply been an evaluation of technical skill or conceptual ability. It has also always been a reflection of social privilege. At the same time, the language of merit has helped to justify forms of social and institutional hierarchy in the name of democratic equality. So because merit seems to refer to notions of individual worth and innate ability, innate talent, that have nothing to do with inherited privilege, it actually works to obscure the very forms of social inequality in which it is grounded. Okay? And what I'm going to show you is that it's only when political challenges to these dominant understandings of merit arise, such as in the demand for reservations, it's only then that we see the workings of social privilege, right, that underpin merit. And this is where, for me, the history of Tamil Nadu, where challenges to caste privilege arose very early, this is where that history becomes particularly important. Okay, so let me first offer a kind of schematic sense of what the dominant understanding of merit actually consists of. Okay, so typically merit is understood as an intrinsic quality of a person that can be seen in individual achievement. It's also typically seen as something objective that can be measured. Okay? And so how is the measurement of merit done? It's commonly done through certain forms of standardization. Right? We see this, for instance, in standardized testing, where the rank is understood as an objective measure of merit. And we also see this in the marketplace, through the competition for jobs, where similarly salary levels are assumed to reflect individual merit. Okay? So because this kind of dominant understanding of merit assumes that it is individual, it is innate, it's objectively measurable, the benefits that accrue to people who are seen as meritorious are seen as justly deserved. Right? But when we look at the history of engineering education in India, we see a much more complicated picture. Right? We see a picture where the evaluation of individual technical ability and skill has always been shaped by social status. So to understand how merit has been defined and who has been deemed meritorious, we need to situate the meaning of merit within a broader context of social inequality. So what I want to show you is that there are continuities, right, in how caste stratification worked in the colonial period and how it works today. At the same time, what I want to say is that the post-independence discourse of merit has actually made it more difficult to see the continuing work of social privilege. Right? It actually helps to obscure it. Okay, so let me now turn to the pre-independence period and lay out some ways that caste stratification worked within British colonial engineering in India. Okay? So from the some of you will know this history, from the mid to the late 19th century, what we see most clearly are efforts to preserve racial barriers, right, to entering the engineering profession. I'm not going to lay those out for you. There's some very interesting books that have done so, including a recent one by Upper Ramnath. So I'll just direct you to some of that other literature. But from the mid to the late 19th century, what we see most clearly, okay, so as I said, racial barriers within the engineering profession, but after that, the demand for inclusion, right, for the Indianization of the profession arises as part of a broader demand, right, for equal representation. And this did see results, and you see over the course of the late 19th through the early 20th century, more and more Indians becoming working engineers. Right? Now, the Indianization of the profession, as it progresses, assumes certain patterns. And what we see quite clearly is that caste becomes a very important basis for inclusion into the profession, and also becomes a basis for stratifying technical training. Okay? And in part, this was because the British tended to see India as a collection of castes and communities. Right? And this is particularly evident in Madras presidency, where educational and industrial policy subscribed quite explicitly to understandings of caste. Right? And there are many examples of how the British kind of mobilized these caste assumptions to evaluate Indian technical ability and to track different kinds of Indians into different tiers of technical training. So, this is a quote, quite a long quote. It's a quote from the Madras Presidency's military board from the 1850s, when engineering college education for Indians first began to be introduced, right? And this is one instance of how Indian engineers were expected to have a particular social background. Okay? I'm just going to read it out to you. A master workman must know his trade and know it well, but a civil engineer has a craft of his own. His skill is in his science. His tools are his formulae and his surveying and mathematical instruments. His labors are for the most part those of the mind. His studies those of projecting and controlling. And he must therefore be one of a very different class and status in society, as well as of totally different attainments from those of the mechanic whose labors he has to direct. So we see from this quote that not only social background is important, the Indian engineer was also supposed to master certain forms of knowledge. Right? The first principal of the Madras College of Engineering, one Lieutenant George Winscombe, put it this way. He said that what the Indian engineer needed primarily was a knowledge in engineering science and intellectual rigor. There was also an emphasis from very early on mathematics as one of the most important parts of the civil engineering career. So these social and intellectual expectations of who an Indian engineer should be decisively shaped patterns of entry into the profession. And it was only those Indians, predictably, with family histories of literacy, right, with family histories of intellectual labor, who were able to enter the ranks of colonial engineering. And we see this in the membership rolls of the Institute of Civil Engineers and the Institute of Mechanical Engineers in London, which were the two main professional engineering bodies in the British Empire. We see from the Indian members, who were quite few, that all were upper caste and most were Brahmin. And this was equally the case with the Institution of Engineers that was set up in Calcutta in 1920 as the Indian counterpart to these metropolitan professional bodies in London. And although some of the first presidents of this Calcutta institution were Europeans, most, after a certain point, were Brahmin members of the Public Works Department or the railways from Madras and Bengal. Okay? And not only were upper caste overrepresented in these professional bodies, one of the ways that they and other Indians demanded the right to employment, to technical employment, within these emerging states like public works, like railways, was as castes. In other words, they petitioned for inclusion as members of certain castes, right? And you see this in the Indian Industrial Commission, which met between 1916 to 1918. This commission heard Indian demands for inclusion, and many of the petitions that were submitted to the commission came from caste associations, right? Where the right to technical education and state employment was expressed as a subset of this broader demand for representative government. Okay, now I'm going to shift to Madras presidency and look more closely at how caste shaped the expansion of engineering regionally. Right? So in Madras, you see much of the same thing, right? The same patterns that apply in the rest of British India apply in Madras, but if anything, they're more acute. Okay? So you see from the reports of the Madras Civil Engineering College that there are very high percentages of Brahmin students, right, in the college. By 1921, the percentage of Brahmin students had reached 74. Right? 74% of students were Brahmin. And this figure is even more astounding when you consider that Brahmins were only 3% of the enumerated regional population. And similarly, if you look in the Madras Public Works Department, you see that Brahmins were very prominent among Indian engineers and were the first Indians to take up senior positions, right, in the department. And by 1900, as early as 1900, the senior grades of the PWD had 87% Europeans, 12% Brahmins, and 1.5% non-Brahmins. And even after communal quotas were introduced, right, in 1921, Brahmins continued to make up over 20% of the total complement of senior engineers in the public works department. Now, by contrast to this preponderance of Brahmins in engineering, the people who were identified as suitable candidates for other forms of technical training, training in handicrafts, training in industrial schools, right? These were people from other caste groups. So in Madras presidency, these groups, this is a very interesting little detail, these groups were explicitly named in the Director of Public Instruction's report as non-Brahmin Hindus. Okay? And they were targeted as such. They were targeted for these forms of technical training as non-Brahmin Hindus. So you see in this report that there's a certain frustration, right, that that the officials feel at the low numbers of recruits from the non-Brahmin population. Okay? Out of the large population of this presidency, less than 3,000 children were receiving technical instruction in the various handicraft and industrial schools. And of these, less than 900 were non-Brahmin Hindus, the class of the community to which the bulk of hereditary workers in wood and metal and textile factories belonged. There is as yet little demand for technical education, and the little advance it has made has practically left unaffected the great mass of the industrial population. So this quote is interesting both because it tells us about the evolution of technical training, and when you put it alongside the other quote, also about the stratification of technical training along caste and class lines. But it's also interesting because we see that colonial officialdom, right, was picking up on the language, the political language of the time, right? So this distinction between Brahmin and non-Brahmin starts to get reflected, right, within these colonial reports. So we see the influence of the non-Brahmin movement sort of picking up pace in the region, right, and starting to influence the thinking of colonial officialdom. So there's one official in particular who appears consistently, right, in these documents, and it's Mr. Alfred Chatterton, who was a professor in the Madras Engineering College. He was a member of the Indian Industrial Commission, and he was also appointed as the superintendent of industrial education in Madras in 1910. And he was especially forceful in advancing the idea that particular Indians were best suited to particular kinds of labor employment. So in this quote, you see, he says, for the indigenous industries, it seems inevitable that we must have recourse to industrial schools. But I would suggest that instruction in each industry should be confined to the sons and relatives of those actually engaged in the industry at the present time. That is to say, we should carry on the industrial schools on a caste basis. Okay? Now, Chatterton's reason, his reason for wanting to organize technical schools, industrial schools along caste lines was as a form of protectionism. Okay? He wanted to ensure that traditional artisans were given priority, right, in technical training, that their existing skills were enhanced through this technical training. So it was a kind of noble ambition. But what it does, what his efforts actually end up doing is that they naturalize the link between caste and particular forms of knowledge and skill. Okay? So as a result, non-Brahmins, this kind of amalgamated category of non-Brahmins, come to be inducted into these lower tiers of technical training, even as Brahmins end up monopolizing professional engineering. Okay? So it's interesting to consider why Tamil Brahmins, who historically were not skilled, right, in technical trades, and largely disdained manual labor, why they entered the engineering profession so readily. Right? There's some interesting work done by two anthropologists, Christopher Fuller and Haripriya Narasimhan. In fact, they have a book that was just released last year called, with a very uncreative title, it's just called Tamil Brahmins. Right? But in that book, they address this question at some length, right? And they argue convincingly that the entry of Tamil Brahmins into engineering is best explained as an expression of their own self-fashioning as a modernizing caste. Okay? So unlike artisanal or industrial labor, which continue to be seen as low-caste work, suited to lower class, low-status work suited to lower class, the elevation of the classroom, right, as the space for training engineers, gave it a higher status as a form of professional labor and not just manual labor, right? Now, in particular, the emphasis on mathematics, right, as the preeminent discipline within engineering was appealing to Brahmins, who considered this to be a highly conceptually valuable and high status form of learning, and one for which they had a natural propensity. Right? Now the second reason, right, and this is again something that Fuller and Narasimhan flesh out in some detail, not quite as much. The second reason for Tamil Brahmins in Chatterton, right, was its association with the colonial state. Now this is not just true of Madras presidency, this is true in Punjab, you see it in Bengal, that engineers who worked for the public works or railway departments derived a real sense of pride, right, and enhanced status from these highly desirable forms of colonial state employment. So much like their entry into medicine, which I won't go into, but they're very interesting parallel patterns, right, when you think about medicine and medical education. Tamil Brahmins' embrace of engineering had everything to do with the fact that engineering was a modern profession associated with conceptual knowledge and with the colonial state, and disassociated from artisanship and industrial labor. Okay? So, to sum up, when engineering was Indianized, this process did not erode existing forms of class privilege and identity. And rather what we see is that it helps to reproduce the privilege of upper class, and it even enhances their self-representation as a modernizing population, right? And so the key takeaway here, not to flog a dead horse, but the key takeaway here is that even as Brahmins and other high castes entered modern professions and lifestyles, right, where secular credentials were more important, the preoccupation with caste status and with caste distinction, right, remained. These persisted. Okay, so let's come to the post-independence period. There's going to be a slight shift in the talk now. What I want to do is look at how constitutional language around redress for historical injustices committed in the name of caste, how this constitutional language has shaped dominant meanings of merit, okay, in India. And one of the key points to keep in mind here about the transition to republican democracy is the adoption of a baseline of formal equality, right? Indian citizens were to be treated at the stroke of midnight. Indian citizens were to be treated as formally equal, right? Even while forms of substantive inequality persisted. And this tension between formal equality and substantive inequality is, of course, a key feature of most democracies, right? Formal equality has served both as an alibi, an easy alibi, for those who would deny the persistence of substantive inequality, right? But it has also been a very important tool for those arguing for the need to bridge the gap, right, between formal equality and the lived reality of stark social, economic, and political differences, right? Now, when it comes to the treatment of caste, this tension becomes hugely consequential, right? So, within the Constitutional Assembly debates leading up to independence, caste is widely regarded as part of Indian social organization that would and should be abolished, right, with social progress. But at the same time, there's a stated commitment to redress, right, for those groups who are historically disadvantaged by the institution of caste. And so these dual imperatives of abolition on the one hand and redress on the other both found place within the Constitution, right? Now, what's most significant for our purposes is how the language of redress, right, actually ends up somewhat paradoxically reinforcing the idea of upper caste as casteless and as meritorious. Okay, so how does this happen? So in the colonial period, you see that there are communal quotas, right? Where upper castes are also assigned quotas just like other groups on the basis of specific identities, right? Unlike that, within the Republican Constitution, the historically privileged appear simply as normative citizens. These are citizens who are unmarked by either identity or by privilege, right? Now we see this reflected within the language of reservations, where only the historically disadvantaged appear as castes. Okay? By contrast, the historically privileged, right, are simply the general category. General category of presumably casteless individual citizens. Okay? So, when you look at this terminology, you see that those in the general category are assumed to embody this constitutional ideal, right, of casteless citizenship. Whereas the reserved category becomes this very negative, right, and almost a tainted departure from that ideal. Okay? So what does it mean? It means that in a perverse twist, the actual relationship between advantage and disadvantage is erased, right? And the reserved come to appear as the ones who benefit from unfair advantages, right? To put it very succinctly, history is erased when it comes to the privilege. Okay? So within the educational domain, right, when you think about this correlation between the general category and the assumption of castelessness, it becomes even more charged when you consider that the other term for the general category is merit-based admissions. Okay? So this equivalence between the general, the casteless, and the meritorious, what does it do? It reinforces the idea that those who fall within the general category do so not on the basis of accumulated advantages, but simply by virtue of their merit. Right? Now, I'm not rehearsing all of this, all the implications of this language, just as an academic exercise. I mean, as all of you are aware, this distinction, right, between the general, meritorious, and casteless on the one hand, and the reserved, unmeritorious, and caste-based on the other, has profoundly shaped the debate around educational equality in India, right? It has allowed the people who fall within the general category to argue that it's the reservation system and not caste privilege that produces inequality, right? And that undermines the modern democratic ideal of equal citizenship. Right? Okay, so what I've just laid out is an analysis of this constitutional language, right? And some of its kind of general social implications. So now I want to turn to how this language gets taken up, right, at the IITs for making claims to merit. Okay? So I think it's useful to think about these claims to merit made in the IITs in terms of three practices, right? One is institutional stratification, one is kind of differentiating between different sorts of training, and the other is evaluations of character. Okay, so I'm going to go through each and talk about how each of these plays out in the IITs in general, but also point to some key differences when it comes to IIT Madras. And in thinking about IIT Madras, what's really important is the specific context of Tamil Nadu, right? With its history of non-Brahmanism and Tamil nationalism. This is very important. And the reason it's important is one of the most obvious outcomes of these political movements is that Brahmins in particular, and upper caste more generally, have been marked as castes. And their historical privilege has been consistently highlighted, right? So in other words, the transformation of privilege into merit within this kind of constitutional discourse, through which caste privilege gets erased, has been far less successful here, right? And in addition, the expansion of reservations to 69% over time has meant that in many ways, it's the reserved category which is the norm, right? That upper castes have to negotiate. Okay? So when we think about IIT Madras and how claims to merit are made, we need to keep in view both this broader context of Tamil Nadu and the constitutional language of redress, right? And how these two things kind of interact and intersect, right, in important ways. So what I want to show you is that claims to merit here are never simply about castelessness, because they can't be, right? They're not allowed to be. Because of this broader context, claims to merit are also always assertions of caste identity and are interpreted as such. Okay? So in other words, like in the colonial period, upper caste today in Tamil Nadu are also very much caste subjects, right? And they think of themselves as caste subjects, even if they believe sincerely and wholeheartedly, and I want to underscore this, right? Even if they believe sincerely and wholeheartedly in merit and in their own merit, right? In fact, I would even argue that for them, caste and merit are experienced as indistinguishable. Okay? Right? To be a Brahmin is to be meritorious, right? And vice versa. So it's not that caste vanishes, it's that caste becomes equated with merit in a very sort of naturalized way. Okay, so I'm going to start with the first strategy, the institutional stratification. So, as you all know, the IITs, from the outset, were set apart, right, as institutions of national importance, where excellence was to be fostered, right, very much part of the immediate post-independence commitment to creating a national cadre of engineers who helped with nation building. And these institutions were afforded a degree of autonomy, right, from the regional structure of university affiliation and linked directly to the center. Now, they also, as you know, received funding and other resources at far higher levels than their competitors, right, than other engineering programs. So all of this, the kind of exceptional status of the IITs, made them more autonomous, not just of the university structure of affiliation, but also autonomous of pressures for democratizing access. So as a result, the IITs have had a more exclusively upper caste faculty and student body than even the next tier of engineering colleges. At the same time, because of the and this is going back to the sort of constitutional language, because of the representative weight of the general category in the IITs, they are widely regarded as spaces of merit rather than as spaces of caste, right? So within them, and you see this in the stories, right, especially from scheduled caste students, within them it seems that only those who fall within the SC/ST quota are treated as members of caste, right, and stigmatized accordingly. So in other words, at the IITs, generally, you see that the general category has come to stand in to some degree for castelessness and the reserved category for caste. But in Tamil Nadu, institutional stratification, right, between central and state institutions has taken on a different set of meanings because of the Regency history. Here, central government institutions are associated much more explicitly with upper class, both by others and by upper class themselves. And one sees this quite clearly at IIT Madras. So here, the association with the central government, it functions as a kind of barrier against the caste politics of the region. You know, this sense of being set apart, right, and of having this other affiliation, right, of being in some ways able to transcend the region, right, is part of what fuels this argument, right, that IIT Madras is the only meritocratic institution, right, in a sea of caste-ridden regional engineering colleges. Right? And to go back to Tamil Brahmins for a minute, for Tamil Brahmins, it's quite clear that the founding of IIT Madras was a unique opportunity, right, to bypass this expanding reservation system and seek refuge in a central government institution where, as they see it, merit and not caste is the sole criteria for admission. At the same time, this choice of IIT Madras is framed as a means to secure the upper caste right to education that has been taken away, right, by regional politics. So in other words, in Tamil Nadu, institutional stratification is interpreted very much through a caste lens. Right? Not only do others see IIT Madras as a preserve of historically privileged upper caste, right? I mean, as some of you know, sometimes IIT Madras is sardonically referred to as Iyengar technology. So there's a kind of almost a humorous kind of referencing of caste privilege, right, as the kind of basis of this institution. But not only do others see it this way, right, it has also been embraced by Tamil upper caste for whom it operates as a space of retrenchment, right, as low caste rights politics takes up more and more political room. Okay, so a second strategy is differences in training, right? So in my interviews, I was struck time and again about this almost kind of common sense perception of the IITs as more conceptually rigorous, right, than other engineering colleges. And what was interesting to me was that for the most part, this argument about conceptual rigor had less to do with the training that students receive, right, at the IITs than with the aura around the JEE. Right? The JEE exam is really what gives the IITs this kind of elevated status, you know, which sort of reinforces what I said at the beginning about standardization. Right? Standardized exams with their sharply individuated and ranked outcomes appear to be objective measures of individual intellectual work, unconnected to social history, and because the JEE in particular is assumed to filter only the best and the brightest out of a vast hand-in-hand pool of candidates, the JEE rank functions almost as a magic talisman of meritocratic excellence, right, that continues to define the IITM for much of his or her life. But again, when you look at the politics of that, the caste contours of this phenomenon become much clearer, right? They're more visible than they are elsewhere. So until 2006, the majority of Tamilians who got into the IITs came from central board schools, right? Such as Kendriya Vidyalaya, DAV, Shankar. These have been the main regional feeders, right, into the IITs. And when we look at who attends these schools, the historical legacy of caste becomes very clear. Central board students in Tamil Nadu are drawn overwhelmingly from families employed within central government services, which is why they were set up in the first place. The vast majority of whom, right, are Brahmin or from other upper castes. So these are families, again, with certain histories in education and state employment, right? These are families where children are cultivated for higher education, for professional success, right? There's a kind of ecosystem that almost breeds success, right? But why in other regions this distinction? I'm not sure how, I actually don't know whether in other regions this distinction between the central and state boards is as marked, right? And is as meaningful as it is here. Here it is certainly meaningful. And here what it does, it signifies a history of caste difference and of caste polarization. Right? As I said, central board schools are almost exclusively identified with upper caste, and the choice of the central boards is a conscious one, right? That's made by them for getting into the IITs and securing educational and professional ambitions in a region which they feel has curtailed their opportunities. Right? In other words, as with institutional stratification, right, differences in training function in Tamil Nadu as both an index of merit and of caste identity. In other words, those who claim merit by virtue of their training within the central boards, their ability to get to pass the JD, are still marked as upper caste, and they see themselves as such. So again, in Tamil Nadu, you see that there hasn't been this as easy a transformation, right, of caste privilege into caste dismerit. Right? Caste as an index remains, and remains very prominent. Right? Of course, as those of you who go to the IITs know, there have been very important shifts in the patterns of admission, right, into the institutions over the past decade because of the rapid expansion of coaching, and also because of the implementation of the 2006 APSC reservations. So these have brought in these new phenomena have brought in new social groups into the IITs who don't come from similar social backgrounds as earlier cohorts, right? And IIT Madras, the most significant change to the student body has, of course, been the influx of students from underprivileged, who are often from lower middle class backgrounds, sometimes lower class backgrounds, non-urban backgrounds, right? Whose parents don't have the same forms of cultural capital, right? Cultural kind of breeding as earlier cohorts. And this is where the evaluations of character internal to the institution become very important. So it isn't that there is no social or even political diversity, right, within the IITs. In the fact that the APSC exists, right, and now it's been replicated across IIT campuses, suggests that there is certainly political diversity, right? And the increasing numbers of low caste and lower middle class students also means that there is increasing social diversity. At the same time, this greater diversity has only enhanced the claim to the IITs by students and faculty who feel that the original character of the institutions has been lost, right, by the influx of people who don't represent meritocratic excellence. Okay? Now here at Ajantha, this is sometimes expressed through the denigration of quota students, right, who are accused of having taken seats away, especially in coveted branches, from those who are more meritorious and more deserving. So even if it's acknowledged that before 2006, there were certainly OBC students who got in through the general category without having to evade the quotas, the default equation is still between being meritorious and being meritorious. This is still very much in place. At other times, you see this evaluation of character those students who are seen as taking more conceptually oriented coaching classes, right? Typically ones from central public schools, and those, for instance, from Andhra Pradesh who attend what was referred to me over and over again as coaching factories. Okay? So what do these statements do? They distinguish the character of who true IITs are, right? Who the real IITs are, from those who have gotten admission to what is seen as less legitimate means. Okay? So low caste quotas, the explosion in coaching, all of this is perceived as threats to the original, more exclusive character, right, of the institution. Now, much of this discussion about the changing character of the institution happens at the level of everyday conversation, or of course in interviews with anthropologists like myself. But there have also been, of course, more systematic efforts, right, to sustain the exclusivity of the IITs through anti-reservation politics. So the last thing I'm going to do is go through 3 examples of anti-reservation politics to see how these arguments about merit have both persisted but also subtly changed, okay, over time. So I'm going to start with one from Tamil Nadu in the 1970s, and then go to the anti-monopoly agitations and end with the 2006 protests. Okay? So one thing to keep in mind is that the opposition to reservations in Tamil Nadu in some ways anticipated the kinds of reactions one now sees across India, from Mandal on. Okay? So in this sense, Tamil Nadu is a very important precedent, right, for understanding anti-reservation politics across the country. So the first example goes back to 1973. Okay? And this is around the time when the 22.5% quota for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes was extended to the IITs. Okay? So at the time, one of the most vocal opponents of the quota was P.B. Ingresan, who was the director of IIT Madras from 1979 to 1984. So in his director's report of 1983, this is what he said. It says, some members of the Parliamentary Committee on Scheduled Castes have gone so far as to say that what we need is an Indian standard and not an international standard of instruction. It is necessary to debate the fundamental question whether, just because a group of people cannot cope with a certain level of education, they should have the veto power to deny such an education to the rest. Whether social justice should imply that there shall be no institution at all in the country where merit shall be the criterion, and also while the socially deprived should have special privileges, the talented need have no rights of their own. This is a pretty loaded book. So the distinction that Ingresan draws between the socially privileged, the socially deprived, and the talented illustrates how upper castes inhabit this casteless norm, right? After all, he refers to upper caste not as the socially advantaged, but simply as the talented, right? Plus, the distinction between special privileges and rights highlights this recurrent theme that reservations are anti-democratic, right? Anti-democratic. And finally, by contrasting an Indian standard, right, from an international standard, right, he argues that the IITs are more in line with a global norm, where excellence is not sacrificed, right, to social justice. Now, in 2011, it was Ingresan who took the Indian government to court, challenging the constitutional validity of the 2006 reservations. See, he was fighting this fight for a long time, right? So, and his pivotal role in the legal battle, right, over the 2006 reservations further underscores the significance of Tamil Nadu as an important precedent, right, in what is now a national anti-reservation politics. Okay, so the second example is from the protests in 1990, okay, sparked by the Mandal Commission's recommendations of 27% for reservations in public sector employment. And as I'm sure many of you remember, at the time, you saw they masqueraded as vendors, as sweepers, right, as shoe shiners, to demonstrate what would happen to them if the Mandal Commission recommendations were passed. Okay? So in effect, what they were doing, they were performing their own reduction to the status of low-caste laborers. Okay? This was a very explicit statement about caste identity, right? And what they felt entitled to, not as unmarked citizens, but as upper caste, right? Now, the most charged act of protest, of course, and the one that got the most media attention, was self-immolation. And the idea that death was preferable to becoming like low caste is a remarkable statement about how caste stigma operates. The final aspect of the Mandal protest that I want to point out is the investment in public sector employment, right? It's hard now to imagine anti-reservation protests being waged to preserve upper caste access to state employment, right? Which only indicates the far-reaching changes that have been brought since economic liberalization, which takes me to the final example of 2006. Now, many of you will have first-hand knowledge of the 2006 anti-reservation protests, both within the IITs and outside. So I'm not going to say too much about that. What I want to emphasize is that these protests were no longer about protecting public sector jobs, right? They were much more about brand dilution, okay? And what the entry of OBCs into institutions like the IITs would mean for the market value of these pedigree. Okay? These protests were waged, this is also significant, they were waged both in India and the US, okay? Where, as you know, there are sizable numbers of IIT alumni. And so there were these kind of parallel moves happening, right? So like students within India organized under the banner of Youth for Equality. Again, equality is the key term, right? Alumni organized in the US as Indians for Equality. Okay. And there was one particular protest which caught my eye, and this was held in Silicon Valley, close to the head offices of Google, Yahoo, Cisco, Intel. And one IIT alumnus who was working as an engineer in Silicon Valley was interviewed by a reporter. And this is what he said. He said, sort of lambasting Arjun Singh, he said, let Arjun Singh do whatever he wants to any educational institute in India, but tell him to leave the IITs alone. It's because of us that the West has recognized the worth of India. Remember, brand India is brand IIT. So two things are important to note here, right? First, that after liberalization, there's been a significant shift, right? From even the early post-independence efforts to secure public sector employment against reservation. Now, as the term brand IIT suggests, an IIT pedigree is a hot commodity in the private marketplace, right? With IITians entering the corporate sector with far higher starting salary packages for students than most other engineering colleges. But we also see something else in this guy's statement. We see that for IITs, brand IIT is as much about money, is as much about cost, right, as it is about money. And the two things kind of work together. So the notion that the entry of low cost threatens the institutional brand, right, suggests that for these alumni and for students today, the market value of brand IIT depends on its continued association with upper class. So what I wanted to show over these three examples was how merit has remained a cornerstone idea, right, in the arguments against reservations, and it has continued to express a certain form of caste privilege, a form of caste entitlement. But we also see that what is being fought for has changed, right, over time. From educational excellence in 1973, to public sector employment in 1990, and brand value in 2006. And these changes are the outcome of transformations in India's emerging economy, are responses to ongoing struggles, right, by democratic movements to advance caste rights in various spheres. Okay, so I'm just going to conclude a very brief comment. As I see it, and this is kind of going back to the discussion of constitutional language, as I see it, the current standoff in here is between two competing visions of democratic equality. The first vision rests on a formal definition of equality, right? That attributes social hierarchies to the natural aptitudes of individuals and groups, right? Yes, there are hierarchies, but the hierarchies are justified because they're based on innate abilities, right, and natural aptitudes. The second definition presupposes the existence of accumulated privileges and disadvantages, and the need for measures to level opportunity. So those who most vocally oppose reservations argue that it undercuts equality of merit. But of course, there are different understandings of equality at stake here. And to my mind, the strident upper caste claim to merit and the discrediting of reservations is unfortunately evidence of increasingly incommensurable visions of the Indian future. That's all I have to say.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was lucid and absolutely wonderful explanation of what we are discussing in class and very as I said, we are open to discussion. We have time and we will take one question, closing question at time. I don't have a mic to go around, so please introduce yourself and be loud and clear and be brief.
My name is Subramanian and I'm from this Community System Science Department. I have two questions. One is more or less comment about the question. My first question is that we have been here talking about the caste system and the reservation system and how it's associated. But we have to discuss about another phase of the reservation system. I mean, there are several folks that which says that there must be some kind of reformulation in our reservation policy. Like, I'm privileged enough to come here because of the SC categories. But I don't think that my sons or daughters, they need reservation, this privilege to enter this institute. Because, so my question is that there should be some kind of policy reformulation, something like reservation line, that people progress and they cross the line and they are not entitled to get that benefit anymore. But here, in our Indian reservation system, what is happening is that as I'm born into some particular reservation category, so no matter how much progress I am, but my sons, my generations, I mean, are able to get the benefits throughout the generation to come. That's one comment. And secondly, even though IIT has a policy of this admission in the different departments according as part of reservation policy, but very interesting phenomenon is happening in the Department of Humanities and Social Science, where students are given reservation during the admission time, but after 2 years, they are given two options. Two streams. They are allocated two streams: development studies or English studies.
Development studies.
And English studies, yeah. So if you study the data, you don't see reserved category students getting crossing those merit lists. I mean, because department has policy of this equal distribution, that they will divide the students into two categories. Like if C is like 42, then 21, like that. So what is happening is that even in IIT itself, there is reservation policy to provide some reservation.
Look, to the question. I mean, I think your point is made. Can you come to the question?
Yeah, my question is what do you think, okay, this policy of division in student on the basis of merit and this stream, stream and development studies. This is the question. Is it the institutional stratification or some kind of, I don't know, why do you look at this?
Sure. I'm not sure I understand the second question, but I can speak to the first. So this question of, when reservations should be phased out. So if there is adequate evidence of certain forms of social advancement across generations, should people from those families or that category stop receiving reservations, right? Now, it depends on how you think about reservations, right? And how you think about caste. So, I could ask the question, I could say, reservations should be phased out at the point where caste stigma vanishes. That regardless of certain forms of socioeconomic advancements, right, there are still forms of caste stigmatization. So in other words, caste as a form of social hierarchy is somewhat independent of other things. They work together, but they're not the same. Not the same. So I could say reservations should continue, and people should legitimately be afforded reservations so far as stigma, right, based on caste, differences of opportunities based on caste persist. Now, the other way to answer the question is what is at the heart of reservations policy, right? It is often perceived as a form of welfare. Right? It's a kind of welfareist measure for people who've been disadvantaged. Right? But if you think about it in terms of representation, then it looks quite different. Right? This is not a handout, right, to people who can't qualify otherwise. It's an effort to equalize representation, right, at the institutional level within a wide variety of institutions. So if you actually go back to the communal quotas of the colonial period, I mean, what's interesting is that in some ways they were demographically based. Right? And the expectation was that these identities would persist, right? And one needed representation, right, based on demographic. So,
and diversity brings in some merit. Diversity within the institution brings in a certain merit to the institution itself.
Sure. I mean, it's interesting because in the U.S., right, the language of diversity is much more prevalent when talking about affirmative action than the language of redress. And I think that that's a problem. Okay? It's a problem because what diversity does, it makes it seem as if, plurality is as good in itself. It erases history. Right? The problem with most of these elite institutions is not the lack of diversity. It's the lack of equal access based on forms of historical disadvantage. And that, I think, drops away when you frame it in terms of diversity. I mean, I understand what you're saying, but I have a kind of knee-jerk reaction to the diversity language because it has taken over in the U.S. That's the only basis on which you can make an argument for anyone from a historically marginalized population. It's the only argument that is seen. You cannot talk about it. You cannot talk about it.
Can I just make a brief point about the diversity argument? Because it's also in a different sense, I think it's relevant to an institution like the IIT,
Yes.
because the age band of students who are admitted through the JEE or the humanities entrance exam, whatever exam, we see that it's narrowing down. You know, that people only who qualify from 1 year of this year will be allowed to write an exam this year. Okay. So while the age qualification might be, eligibility might be 23 years, you have only people who have qualified in a certain year eligible to write the exam next year. So the age-wise, the groups are not diverging. You want to narrow the age band of a group as much as possible. So I feel that this is also a kind of diversity. And to my mind, it will have an impact on the overall classroom atmosphere and the overall whatever positive diversity it is. Also in terms of age, I think it brings a lot of positives to the classroom situation. I just want to add this. There is an age dimension to debates within IIT also right now, and that may also have diversity debate in this manner. But the other question Tulunga asked, I think it's something that is being debated Tulunga also. You also are aware of that, and maybe we can leave it for a. It basically addresses whether if you have reservation advantage benefits and at the entry level to any profession or to any program.
Basically says that
whether it should continue in quote unquote advancement as well. There was a very famous case with IAS officials. I think IAS officers had indeed said that while there is reservation at the entry level to the IAS, but beyond a certain the promotions or the advancement in the reservation, which comes to the which makes this thing that because several people who get into special privileges get in maybe 3 or 4 years later than the meritorious ones. There is a real problem at the topmost level, that secretary level or joint secretary level above, because there is an age bar. So people who progress through the line, they don't go beyond because of the age bar. If I start my career as meritorious candidate at 24, when I start at 29, then I can become a deputy for
So the deferral acts as a...
There was a similar case in the IAS services also, and what your question relates to is whether the special privilege should continue in advancement or in this case in the allotment of streams, etc. So that I think we can defer.
I just want one simple comment. Usually says there is, for example, I'm coming from a remote area in Northeast, and I have come here to study, and I want to study the urban studies, and I'm supposed to compete with those students who are studying in some international schools in Chennai within 2 years to get development studies.
Three hands of Bala.
This is about the reform movements for reservation going on. There has been a movement by Manika community. They have been asking for SC subclassification because Manikas feel they have been historically they have not been able to reap the benefits of reservation as well as Malas. Malas are the dominant SC community within Andhra Pradesh. So Manikas have been asking. I mean, there are people that this reservation system also leaves out. Because if you see in IITs, if you take a census of who among the SCs or SCs comes in, you will find that there is a certain uniformity to who comes in. So there are people who are being left out by the current reservation. And also, there is also sort of an envy that is created among these communities, because when you see those people taking reservations, and these are the people who have been excluded, and there is sort of this sort of disharmony that happens within the community. And I am talking about also Muslim community within Andhra Pradesh. because there is no caste, there has been no caste sense of Muslims taken post independence after. I mean, Muslims, if in Andhra Pradesh, if we take a caste census, they will be qualifying to OBC. They are right now BC within the state, they come in the backward classes within the state list, but they cannot apply for reservations within central institutes. There is a certain sort of people who have been excluded from the reservations. There has been a disharmony and sort of envy that develops between these communities. And talking about Andhra, it is true that there are factories, there is no doubt in that, but I am right now thinking that it's very interesting how the Brahmins see this factory is also a less meritorious thing, and how within the factories the upper caste see the SCs as they're less meritorious. It's interesting how exact caste hierarchy is built, because the Brahmins coming from central schools look at these people coming from factories as less meritorious, and these people will look at the SCs within those factories as less meritorious. And it's also, the factories work in a very different way. They also target communities from the reservations for their ranks. It's like they have a special kind of treatment going on in parallel. So within the students also there is an envy or stigma that's happened within the factories also. I mean, there are upper caste people who will be saying, you need not study that art, you will get a seat anyway. There is within factories there's sort of disharmony. I just wanted to point on that.
I mean, I'm certainly not arguing that any policy instrument, whether reservations or otherwise, is perfect. I mean, obviously all policy instruments need to face consistent reform, right, and need to be subjected to scrutiny. Now, I know that you're not making this argument, but often the kind of creamy argument is made to discredit reservations altogether, and not as an argument for reform, reformulation, right, fine-tuning, etc. So, certainly, I mean, again, and I would even say that policy instruments are not the final solution, right? I mean, if ultimately what we're talking about, right, are forms of social hierarchy, stigmas, right, differences in opportunity and access, right, to employment, education, these things aren't necessarily fixed, right, through a kind of policy measure. One needs a social movement, right? One needs a transformation of social consciousness. I mean, literally. I gave a talk on this in Delhi, and it was very interesting. There's a student, a Dalit student in the audience who stood up and said that she had availed of the SE quota, right, to get admission into the college. And she said that she experienced it as a form of shame, right? Simply inhabiting that category, right? She experienced that as a form of shame. And that she said that it basically took her going to a class taught by Gopal Guru, right, on shame and stigma, to recognize that this is not some handout, this is her right, right? And the only way to overcome that sense of shame is to keep in view, right, that those who don't avail of the quota don't need it for particular reasons, right? They don't need it because they've had all sorts of advantages. So and certainly, I mean, we're talking about, it's not an infinitely expandable pie, right? So the flip side of inclusion is exclusion. There will be people left out. So again, I think it requires vigilance, right? It requires a certain kind of vigilance. Now, does the vigilance mean that, certain castes are no longer eligible, right? Should they fall out of, the reservation system? It really depends on how you see the purpose of reservations, right? And whether you think, getting into IIT or Harvard completely mitigates, caste or racial stigma. There's an interesting study that was done, sorry, just one last point. There's an interesting study done at Harvard, I can't remember what the center is called, but it's basically a sort of research outfit that looks at race, race and discrimination. And what they did this kind of a pilot study of admissions, of the admissions process. What they did was they sent out, I think it was 5 sets of identical CVs, identical resumes, right? One had a white sounding name and one had a black sounding name, right? Identical resumes. And 9 out of 10 times, the black sounding name did not use it. In India, right?
Yeah. They send with Muslim surname Madras.
Where you were writing on this last page at the bottom, it says 69% in Tamil Nadu. It's actually 58. For another 19 seats, they are giving 69 seats. This issue is also being taken last week. They agreed to preserve the state for the knowledge. Moreover, there is no OBC statement, APSC, PC, APSC 30, and then APSC 2030, that PC Muslim policy. So that should be corrected. Second page, the first paragraph bottom is that IIT there are 464 professors. General category is 464, OBC 59, SC 11, and SC 2. Where did you get this sense? No, the fact of the matter, they have not implemented reservation back in 18. I don't know why. In the last year, I got updated.
So this was, these were the results of an RTI.
They all came to merit. They are not implemented. They have been consistently inconsistent. They are exempted. They are giving complementary system. They are giving in a science and technology.
But that point was not about faculty reservations. That point was simply about the distribution of faculty.
All came to merit. When the question of distribution, where there is no reservation. They not follow the rule of reservation.
No. That point in my article was not about faculty reservations. The point was simply about the
They all
distribution of
come to merit.
faculty.
How can you classify under OBC and SC?
But this was what the RTI asked for.
I've been getting articles from my last week. After the report to me, they are accepted.
What?
Just because they said
I was the one who filed that.
Parliament, they gave wrong information. We are following flexible complementary system for ACSC, OBC faculty appointment. They have not given till today what is complementary, flexible complementary system.
Let us not get stuck in the issue. Let us not.
I filed the case is pending. Yes, sir. Wait. RTA, they give you anything. They have not given me anything. They have not given me anything. They have not given 121 documents. It's not about research. They have not given 121 pages documentation. This is categorized and there is a
One second. There are three happen.
if they all come to merit, you can't classify. If they give quota, you can say OBC, SC. They are not implementing. Last 2 weeks that they give.
About categories. You're saying that these categories only make sense as reservation categories.
Only when they come through SC or OBC reservation, you can say.
Why?
Okay.
They have not followed the rule of reservation. Then how can we classify them? They all came to merit, all merit based.
Can we, but this doesn't apply to students. So can we suspend this debate for a while? This doesn't apply to students, so let's suspend it for a while. Okay, good. Just keep brief and.
I am written to Colonial. I am a research scholar in metallurgical and materials. My point is simple. 1950, the first reservation being brought. Now 40 years passed over. 40 or 50 or 65 years passed over. Now government is seeking to increase the pattern. I think the reservation categories came for to upward the backward. But 65 years, is it not enough time to upload backward? This reservation category, if it is necessary, that means the 65 years is not hopeful to apply the backwards. That is my point. Yes. And second, you told that one more thing in the colonial thing that this in Bengal and both in Tamil Nadu, that most Brahmin people got into this. I also said Brahmin and the Greek category. Just one clarification there, because after what I have seen in my engineering jobs, it is a pity thing that both the civil caste category and the general category, they work by same positions and same category, and the performance is well enough. So in that position, in that point, in that takeover, when we are taking the students, when we are admitting, especially in the colleges like IITs or IITs, the top grade colleges, is it necessary to put the reservation category here? Because up to a certain point, the reservation category is okay. You can think about
better to add on what number of people who are selected in general category. Because the general category is not only meant for certain particular social group. It is meant for everybody. If you unpack this percentage of general category, where number of people are selected. Because he said how long the reservation will continue. And there is a clear-cut case in JNU 1990. The person who selected, you cleared the gold medal in zoology in Madras University, and All India level topper in All India JNU entrance exam. And he was supposed to take a SC/ST quota. And similarly, K.R. Narayan's daughter who wrote the UPSC exam, and she was supposed to give an SC/ST quota, and she is not applied. She is not claimed that she wanted to be SC/ST quota. But the system is forcing to. Even my case, I have been selected in the merit in my own institute. When I asked for where is the reservation in 35 years in the history of in the institute, finally I have been told, I have been humiliated that you are here. Though we may not have a policy, but you are here. I said, please don't ever in a dream think that I come from reservation. I am not demeaning a reservation, people come to a reservation. But I compete with the merit. I am selected on a merit. And whose fault it is? Whose fault it is that giving a reservation, putting a candidate in a reserve quota? Because it is a de-recognition merit is a major, because you need to unpack certain things much more, because that will be advanced in terms of the paper you are presenting. Thank you very much for a very elusive and very powerful paper. Thank you.
I actually want to respond. So, one, so I think one thing that you said is very important, which is that if everyone who comes from non-orthodox is expected, right, to avail of the quota, even if they can get into the general category, right? What that in effect does is two things. One is it denies that seat, right, to another person who could avail of the quota. And the other thing it does is that it reinforces the equation between the general category and photographs. Right? Now, I agree with you that it's important to unpack this category, right? To see who gets in and who actually inhabits it. Right? But part of what I was trying to argue is that it doesn't matter who inhabits it. In terms of the social meaning of the categories, right? It is equated with being upper caste, right? The dominant definition of the category, the meaning of the category, right, is that it's only certain people who can enter, right, through the process. So, for that reason, I think it's very important to look at one of the stories from IIT that I didn't tell, which here in the 1990s. Right? And he told me the story about, and he's Tamil. And he told me the story about how, very early on when he first came to the dorm, he shared his dorm room with a Tamil Brahmin roommate. And he had come out of the bath and was changing his shirt, and the Tamil Brahmin roommate said to him, "Where's your guna?" And he just replied, "I don't wear one." Right? And he said, the guy responded, "Wow, you must come from a very liberal Brahmin family." And so, this is an example of somebody who, as you say, got in through the general category, right? But was assumed to be Brahmin because anything else was unthinkable. So there are plenty of examples like this, right, of a kind of slippage in meaning, right, which points to this kind of hard and fast equation between being general category.
I don't know your name, but
My question is, how would you compare the inclusiveness, class inclusiveness that exists in highly institutes in the United States and the caste inclusiveness that exists in the IITs? How would you, am I clear?
Yeah.
And also, I also have this opinion that the kind of objective testing that happens in the standardized tests, for example, JEE, makes IITs and IIT-like institutes more accessible than what happens, the entrance, the kind of examination that students in the United States have to go through to get into IIT. Would you agree with it?
before you respond, is the noise bothering you or just it is
It's okay.
I think the more salient comparison is not class but race.
Yeah, class. Race, yes. Yeah.
So, affirmative action policy, race-based affirmative action policy in the U.S. has been systematically dismantled. The only way that within private, ironically, within private institutions, right, one has the kind of autonomy to be able to factor in, right, other criteria, right? One doesn't have to sort of apply as rigid a measure. And so I come from social science discipline, and when we do our admissions process, we factor in all sorts of things, right? There's not a standardized exam. There is the SATs,
Yeah.
but there are many of us.
Which makes it even more difficult for people from, even in the United States, you have all these, private school students who have access to,
Absolutely.
all kinds of counseling, for college admissions.
Absolutely.
Which makes it, exclusive again.
Elite education in the U.S. is profoundly exclusive.
Exactly.
You're not going to get an argument on that
Yeah.
from me. What I do want to say, though, is that there is this kind of myth of standardized testing being more accessible, right? Because
Is it? This is my question.
because
Yeah.
everyone
Can go attend the coaching factory and
right,
get
and everyone can sort of master this